LaFaso and Disson. Okay. Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you. Um, when you're ready, we're going to be looking at you all the time. So give us a cue. Yeah. What will it be? Right there.
Oh, are you going to say it? My name?
That's how we were going to do it.
It's like the Oscars. Your intro is, so she's going to hand it over to you. I'm going to say, we'd first like to introduce to you Professor Patricia Lee. Professor Lee. Hey, Tito, can I leave this stuff up here?
My stuff up here also.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. I'd ask you this time to please turn off any cell phones or other noise-making devices. They interfere with our wireless microphones here. I'd like to thank you all for coming this morning for a very interesting and fascinating talk. We're about to hear from a very distinguished professor, former professor here at West Virginia University. Dr. Williams, thank you for joining us this morning. And then an enlightening panel discussion will follow the event. We'll take a quick break right at 12:45 for necessities, but I ask you all please to come back as soon as possible into the room. Again, thanks for coming, and we'll start in a few moments. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending the West Virginia University College of Law Sesquicentennial panel celebrating entrepreneurship, innovation, and job creation in West Virginia. My name is Tito Alarshala, and along with Brian Corcoran, we are your MCs for this afternoon.
Great. Thank you, Tito. First today, we'd like to introduce to you Professor Patricia Lee. Professor Lee is a visiting professor and director of the Entrepreneurship Law Clinic here at the West Virginia University College of Law. She teaches the Entrepreneurship Law Clinic class, and she directs the Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Law program here at the College of Law. The ELC is a program that provides legal services to entry-level entrepreneurs, small businesses, and nonprofits. Professor Lee is also serving currently as the parliamentarian of the WVU Faculty Senate. Before coming to WVU, Professor Lee founded the National Institute for Urban Entrepreneurship. That's a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit, nonpartisan organization formed to stimulate, create, and grow private enterprise in urban communities. She also worked for the Institute for Justice, which is a public interest law firm in Washington, D.C. There, she served as managing vice president and national director of clinical programs, and was the founding director of its Clinic on Entrepreneurship at the University of Chicago School of Law. While at the University of Chicago School of Law, she also served as lecturer of law, teaching entrepreneurship and law and entrepreneurial advocacy. Early on in her career, Professor Lee served as in-house corporate counsel for McDonald's Corporation in Oak Brook, Illinois. Professor Lee has won numerous awards for her service to the community, to the business community, and to the students. Some of those awards include the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award, the Ron Brown Minority Advocate of the Year Award from the United States Department of Commerce, and the McDonald's President's Award. Professor Lee holds a BA in economics with a focus in mathematics from Northwestern University, as well as a JD from Northwestern University School of Law. She's also completed 1 year of coursework towards a Doctor of Management at the University of Maryland. She's also written numerous law review articles and scholarship on entrepreneurship, clinical programs, eminent domain, and questioning the effectiveness of managerial decision-making in global outsourcing. We'd like you to join us in welcoming to the discussion Professor Patricia Lee.
Thank you, Tito and Brian. That was fabulous. On behalf of the Entrepreneurship Law Clinic, I welcome all of you today to our symposium here at the College of Law, and it's our first symposium celebrating West Virginia's Sesquicentennial year and celebrating West Virginia entrepreneurship. So we thank you all for attending today's events. There are so many people to thank, to congratulate, but let me say who the co-sponsors are. The co-sponsors of today's events are the WVU College of Law, the Friends of Blackwater, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Benedum Foundation, and also we'd like to thank Dean Joyce McConnell, Justice Starcher, Tom and Judy Rod, Kitty Dooley, Professor Ellis, and the students in the Entrepreneurship Law Clinic who are sitting here in the front rows. The students did a tremendous job, extraordinary job of pulling this event together, and it couldn't have happened without them. I just have a couple of housekeeping matters before we turn to our keynote speaker, Dr. John Williams. First, today's program, there are folders with the latest economic forecast about Morgantown and West Virginia that are out front. So please make sure that you get a copy of that. It's in the blue folder out front. As well as we have available for you law review articles from the last symposium that was done here at the university by the Entrepreneurship Law Clinic. So please feel free to take one for free, no charge. And then you have a copy of the program for today. And so that will give you an idea of the agenda and how we will proceed from the first event of the keynote speech to the panel today. The second thing that I'd like to mention is that when you look at your program, you'll see that the keynote address from our esteemed historian, Dr. John Williams, will be followed by a panel discussion. So there, in between, there will be a moment of transition, and then the reception to follow, which we invite all of you to take part in that. I'd like to turn it over to Professor Robert Bastris, John W. Fisher II, Professor of Law, who will make the introduction of Dr. John Williams.
Welcome. Dr. John Alexander Williams is Professor Emeritus at Appalachian State University. Prior to taking emeritus status, Dr. Williams was the Greer Distinguished Professor of History and Director of Appalachian Studies. He is currently the Executive Director of the Foggy Bottom and West End Advisory Neighborhood Commission in Washington, D.C. His first job was to try to remember the name of that. He has earned a BA degree from Tulane and a master's and PhD from Yale University. It's a school in Connecticut. He previously taught prior to going to Appalachian State, he taught at WVU, and prior to that at University of Illinois at Chicago and at Notre Dame. He is widely published, and his many books include a Weatherford Prize winner published in 2002 called Appalachia, A History. The book interweaves social, political, environmental, economic, and popular history of the region covering several centuries. And throughout the book, a wide range of Appalachian voices enliven the analysis and remind us of the importance of storytelling in the ways the people of Appalachia define themselves and the region. He also published in 2000, Sinking Columbus, which had the subtitle of Contested History, Cultural Politics, and Myth-Making in the Quincentenary. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The 500th anniversary, of course, of Columbus. His book, published originally in 1976 with the second edition in 2001, called West Virginia, A History, is probably the most widely adopted text in this state. He also wrote and published West Virginia and the Captains of Industry, also a widely used text. Whenever lists are made of the preeminent historians in the Appalachian region, the name of John Alexander Williams will always lead it. And I introduce him to you now. Dr. Williams.
Thank you for that generous introduction. I am going to start with a story, but I think I also have to talk about the word sesquicentennial. I was the executive director of the Christopher Columbus Quincentennial Jubilee Commission, which is the longest title I've ever had. But the Foggy Bottom West End Neighborhood Commission is almost as long. Unfortunately, I've just resigned that position, and so I won't have such a grand title. I have to admit that the sesquicentennial snuck up on me, but I remember the centennial vividly. In 1963, I was living in the slums of New Haven, Connecticut. Those of you who are in graduate school can understand that. New Haven at that time had the very ambitious urban renewal program, the most expensive and on a per capita basis, the most expensive and extensive in the nation. The block on which I was living consisted of vacant buildings waiting to be torn down. And in the center of this weed-filled block, there was a junk car with West Virginia tags. And this drew my attention for two reasons. First, in anticipation of the centennial, the West Virginia Garden Clubs had launched a crusade against junk cars that littered the roadsides of the state and which had become a topic of interest during the 1960 presidential primary. It was rather depressing to me that this symbol of West Virginia's woeful economy had followed me north to booming Connecticut, which I think is still the wealthiest per capita state in terms of per capita income. It certainly was back then. A second, more practical reason was that West Virginia license plates in those years expired with the fiscal year. And in prior years, the expiration date was stamped on the plate itself. It said EXP 6/30/62. But the plate on my car was different because of the centennial. The expiration date had been left off. And the plates issued that year simply said West Virginia Centennial 1963. And that was important to me because I was broke. The summer job I had lined up had fallen through, and while I had finally found a substitute job in the Yale Library, not enough money had come in for me to afford to renew my car registration. And I thought, who in New Haven is going to know this, since the license plate said 1963? Well, of course, I became acutely aware of every car in New Haven that had a West Virginia tag that might educate the local cops to the fact that my ride was illegal. There were 4 West Virginia cars in the whole city as far as I could discover. In addition to my car and the junk car in the center of the abandoned block, there was a shiny Jaguar convertible parked every day near the old campus. That's the part of Yale that holds its most historic buildings and was traditionally the home of Yale freshmen. A bestseller of the previous year of 1962 was Harry Caudle's Night Comes to the Cumberlands, which drew national attention to the desperate economic plight of the Appalachian coalfields and set in motion the movement that culminated in the creation of the Appalachian Regional Commission. One of Caudle's points, later elaborated on in his other publications, was that the entrepreneurial class in West Virginia, or in Appalachia generally, the small-town bankers, merchants, property owners, as well as those courthouse politicians that took an entrepreneurial approach to government, were small fry collaborators in the big businesses and absentee landowners who exploited Appalachia's natural resources with so little return to its people. The Jaguar convertible sported the license plate holder of a Huntington dealership. And so I naturally concluded that its owner was a member of Appalachia's comprador class, as I later labeled them in my doctoral dissertation. drawing on my knowledge of European history to dredge up a word for Portuguese agents in colonial India. As you might imagine, I had not gone to Yale to study West Virginia history. I was a European history specialist and, in fact, had used advanced placement exams to test out of all U.S. history requirements during my undergraduate career. But my summer job in the Yale Library included cataloging a collection of documents that a long-dead professor had assembled from mid-19th century Virginia. This task, plus Caudle's book, had already unsettled my intention to become a European historian. But the tipping point came when a fourth car appeared in New Haven bearing West Virginia tags. Now, New Haven, as I've stated already, was a center of urban renewal and thus of construction jobs. And so, as fate would have it, an unemployed miner from Boone County, West Virginia, moved next door to me and brought with him his family. They occupied a small apartment above a vacant corner store. In addition to his wife, there were 4 children. You can guess the first thing that these kids said to me: "Your license plate's expired." The rest is history, as they say. These kids, in their sad exchange for the city sidewalks, for the woods around their Boone County home, helped me decide to delve into the essential paradox of West Virginia as it seemed then. Why was it such a good place to live and a bad place to make a living? I abandoned my plans for a dissertation on European intellectual history. The end result, as Professor Bastrop said, is 3 books on West Virginia, 1 on Appalachia, a clutch of periodical articles and encyclopedia entries. And this output, of course, gained me a lot of knowledge about the West Virginia statehood movement and the Civil War, and also a comfortable retirement, during which I've refocused my current research on urban history, which I taught for several years and which is a product of those same years in New Haven, when New Haven was leading the effort to rebuild itself while the federal dollars flowed. I'm also working on a book about my West Virginia hometown. I'd like to know more about the entrepreneurs who turned the village of Dry Creek into the town of White Sulphur Springs in 1909, but I never thought much about the relationship of entrepreneurs to the statehood movement until Professor Lee called to invite me to talk to you today. The only passage from my books that bear directly on her concerns from my is a story I told in West Virginia and the Captains of Industry about a small Parkersburg company. Today we would call it a startup that undertook to manufacture aniline dyes from coal tar derivatives. These dyes, which made economic history as the first mass-produced synthetic materials, freed textile manufacturers from dependence on natural dyestuffs, some of which were exotics that had to be imported from tropical regions, other of which were rare. They were all expensive, whereas the new dyes could be made from the byproducts of coke ovens. Demand for coke was rising because demand for steel was rising. But the beehive ovens then in use in West Virginia did not capture the byproduct gases and residues from which aniline dyes could be made. If this startup company had succeeded, it's safe to say the conversion from beehive to byproduct ovens would have happened a lot more swiftly in West Virginia. But the startup did not succeed. The entrepreneurs gave up and returned to Brooklyn, New York, which is where they had come from, and where they would prosper in other areas of industrial chemistry during the 20th century. The reason is the mongrel tariff of 1883, so called because it embodied no particular fiscal or economic principle, but because it was a hodgepodge of levies that had been worked out by congressmen responsive to particular business interests in their home districts. And the deal that West Virginia senators made on this matter was typical. The tariff on bituminous coal remained high, while New England representatives got a low tariff on aniline dyes imported from Germany. This meant that West Virginia coal sales in the New England market were protected against competition from the nearby Cape Breton coal fields of Canada. while the Parkersburg startup went speedily out of business. Would West Virginia have become a center of industrial chemistry a half century before the branch plants along the Kanawha and Ohio rivers began to spread? In my first book, I implied that this was a lost opportunity and that it would have made a long-term difference in the economic history of the state. Now I'm not so sure, but in any case, I went back to this anecdote, examined more sources, and was still unable to find any connection between it and the statehood movement, except for the basic facts of the state's political economy found in most of my writings. That the domination of the state's political system by the owners of extractive industries and their hangers-on leads to aborted opportunities for more sustainable sources of prosperity for the state. Note that the word entrepreneur is a French word. We use French words when we don't really know exactly what we mean. Or is it naive to think that? Actually, the students who escorted me around this morning gave you a pretty good definition. But one advantage of my years at Yale is that I knew French economic history. In the middle of the 19th century, France had the third most advanced industrial economy in the world. The fourth, it may surprise you to learn, was what would have become the Confederate States of America. But there was a big gap between numbers 3 and 4 and numbers 1 and 2, which were the economies of Great Britain and of the northeastern United States. The French and the Southern nationalists in the U.S. were aware of this gap, and a system for dealing with it had emerged from the writings of the economist and philosopher Henri de Saint-Simon. Essentially, Saint-Simonians argued that in the absence of sufficient pools of private capital to stimulate economic development, it was the duty of the state to mobilize capital through taxation and to invest public money in essential infrastructure. In the perpetual ups and downs of post-Napoleonic France, Saint-Simon's ideas particularly appealed to Bonapartists, and with the return of Bonapartists to power in France in 1851, they became the reigning French economic program, leading to such state-sponsored enterprises as the National Railway System and the rebuilding of Paris under Baron Haussmann. Saint-Simonian ideas were also implemented in the American South in two particular forms: state government ownership of or investment in railroads. It was different in every state. In Georgia, the state owned the railroad. In North Carolina, the state owned the North Carolina Railroad until fairly recently, the 1990s. But in Virginia and Tennessee, it was through private investment. The second aspect of this Bonapartist program was the creation of military schools, not because they were plotting civil war, although some were, but because based on Napoleon's École Polytechnique in Paris, this was the principal source of engineering training in the United States and in the world, for that matter. In Virginia, the adoption of this system was promoted by Claudius Crozet, a Bonapartist refugee and West Point engineering professor who between 1823 and 1864 served as the state engineer of Virginia. He designed the road system of Western Virginia and supervised State Geological Survey, was one of the founders of the Virginia Military Institute. Crozet also helped to build the Virginia Railroad system that was financed by state government underwriting of privately issued corporate bonds. And what might also say in these southern railroads were also financed by the unpaid labor of slaves, not entirely, but substantially. Virginia politics led to investment in too many lines, at least one leading west from each of Virginia's tidewater ports, and thus to an incomplete and inefficient system. The huge state indebtedness incurred by this system was very much on the minds of the West Virginia state makers. It has helped to determine West Virginia's boundary with Virginia, and it led to a constitutional prohibition against state investment in private enterprises. West Virginia entered the Union in a distinctly non-Napoleonic mode. Most of the decisions made in the Constitutional Convention of 1861-63 were made by lawyers, and I'm sure it will please you to hear that, even though the lawyers at that time were greatly outnumbered by an unusually large number of farmers, teachers, ministers, and merchants who took part in public life during those years. But there were 6 members of the convention listed as merchants, plus 1 hotel keeper, and Daniel Lamb, trained as a lawyer, but who identified himself as the cashier of the Bank of Northwestern Virginia in Wheeling. Could these 8 be said to have represented an entrepreneurial interest in the convention, expressing a point of view that helped shape the institutions of the new state? First, let me point out that the recent Civil War survey by the British military historian John Keegan argues that the economic power of the North was decisive in determining the war's outcome, and thus West Virginia's permanence. He defines the economic North as extending above a line drawn from St. Louis to Louisville to Baltimore. In West Virginia, such a line passes roughly from the mouth of the Great Kanawha River to the point in Jefferson County where the Shenandoah River enters the state. And this line would neatly define the Unionist heartland that held the preponderant share of support for creating a new state from Virginia Territory. South of that line was a no-man's land of rugged terrain, guerrilla warfare, and a leadership that, with few exceptions, supported the Confederacy and remained loyal to Virginia. Most of the merchants in the Constitutional Convention all came from north of Keegan's line, but there was very little else that united them, at least as in terms of my reading of the Constitutional Convention's debates. The Morgantown merchant Henry Daring was one of the most outspoken in repudiating Virginia's Bonapartist schemes of economic development, and most of his fellow merchants went along with him. Daring and Lamb also led the opposition to incorporating the Greenbrier Valley into West Virginia, but did not offer an economic rationale for this position. I could find no other issue that engaged a united entrepreneurial interest, nor even one that expressed an entrepreneurial point of view. And some of the merchants simply said nothing at all except to answer roll calls. But there were other forms of entrepreneurship besides the retailing, wholesaling, banking, and manufacturing enterprises that were represented in the convention. There was land speculation. This had been a principal avocation in West Virginia since the days of George Washington and his land prospecting trips here. This was a major preoccupation of the established political leadership of the region that was known in Wheeling or Morgantown or Parkersburg as the interior. During the first half of the 19th century, this interior leadership had wrested control of the land allocation process from the Richmond government and had vested it in the circuit court system, which they dominated. Most of this leadership had gone south in 1861. That's the way it's phrased. But not all of them had. 2 lawyers from Charleston, Benjamin H. Smith, who represented Logan County in the convention, and James H. Brown, almost single-handedly persuaded the convention to extend the borders of the new state to encompass half of what was then called southwestern Virginia, thereby including a large share of the mineral and timber resources that had been identified in Crozet's earlier surveys. The Kanawha lawyers lost out on the vote that prohibited state investment in or underwriting of corporate bonds, but they wrangled a compromise that allowed counties and municipalities to do so. And while the land lawyers were a distinctly old-fashioned lot, as the 1872 Constitutional Convention that they dominated demonstrated, there was no hard and fast line separating land speculation from what we would call entrepreneurship. The 2 best-known West Virginia entrepreneurs of this period, Henry Gassaway Davis and Johnson N. Camden, invested profits from their early industrial enterprises in wild lands, as they were called. It was only after Davis failed to find buyers for his land in the upper Potomac region that he undertook to develop mining and town-building enterprises there and the feeder railroads that made them feasible. Camden and Davis went in together on a huge tract of land in central West Virginia known as the Caperton lands, after Allen Caperton, former senator from Virginia in the Confederate Congress. Caperton, by the way, was also one of the entrepreneurs that created the White Sulphur Springs Company, the principal employer in my hometown, which later, under different ownership, erected the Greenbrier that I have described elsewhere as, quote, a pious monument to the imagined graces of the Old South, close quote, and has recently made more news on the entrepreneurial front. There might have been some entrepreneurial restiveness against antebellum Virginia's state banking system and its restrictive impact on credit, but banking issues had been superseded by the National Banking Act of 1862. The availability of investment capital remained limited in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. It was not until the 1880s that West Virginia's industrial economy began to take off, and not until the end of the century that we can see the state's 20th century profile coming into view. In short, the statehood movement and 19th century entrepreneurship were like the elephant and the alligator. They inhabited adjacent zones, but it's hard to see how they affected each other, except by the operations of political economy. The creation of a new state provided an arena wherein numerous programs would later emerge to stimulate and regulate economic activities. But as late as 1897, the state government employed less than 100 persons in its operations. Unlike the reign, its ministrations may not have fallen impartially, but they were assuredly gentle. The most prosperous parts of West Virginia were precisely those areas that had been most prosperous under Virginia, largely for reasons of geography and not politics. And with the significant exception of the Kanawha Valley, they still are. Thank you. No questions about Benjamin Smith? You can
hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, right.
I'm just interested in what you might know about the history of this development of the salt production along the Kanawha into the later chemical industry, going all the way back to the beginning.
It is an antecedent of the chemical industry as it developed, but it's not the primary reason that there was a chemistry industry in the Kanawha Valley. By the time, tonight we'll have with us at the Erickson Alumni House, we'll have the expert on the Kanawha Valley salt industry, John Staley. He can answer this, but if you'll, I think he wrote the article in the West Virginia Encyclopedia on the salt industry, and it hadn't totally died out by the time that chemicals came along. But, and the brine on which it was based was a raw material that the modern chemical industry used, but by and large coal and natural gas were more important in drawing them, and the hydroelectric power.
Well, thank you.
It's a little bit tangential to what you've been talking about the entrepreneurship, but I mean, in my education of myself in the last couple of years to get ready for working on this project about statehood, obviously it's pretty clear that these particular individuals in Wheeling, a number of them, who were early adopters of the Republican political philosophy,
right,
that these were the people who sort of seized the time and created West Virginia. So can you talk a little bit about what you think their perspective was? Were they agents of capital from other areas? the bottom line, it seems to me, is that when they were drawing the line between West Virginia and Virginia, I put this in the program for the show we're doing tonight because I learned it from you, that there wasn't a certainty as to how the war was going to end. And they actually thought they might be in a separate country. To go to Virginia, you would have had a passport. They were drawing an international boundary, and they had to decide which way they wanted to jump in that circumstance. How off the base do you think that is, and how did that affect these business people's mindset?
Well, I think it affected, and I'll answer this in making several points. First of all, it was during a war. It was during a war that was not thousands of miles away, but a few dozen miles away. So can imagine what it would be like being in the Constitutional Convention in Afghanistan or Iraq, and you have an idea of what those people were dealing with. Because while the Ken Burns Civil War, all the battles took place in national parks, but they didn't. They didn't in real life. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. Wheeling was part of that northern industrial complex that John Keegan and many others have said were essential to victory on the part of the North. And even though the South was advanced industrially compared to most countries in Europe, and remember Germany wasn't a country yet, it wasn't anything by comparison. And the people in Wheeling, quite properly, were concerned about being cut off from their natural trading parties, trading partners. And Peter Van Winkle from Parkersburg, the head of the Northwestern Virginia Railroad, said as much. As where they came from, I can think of, if you look at their individual biographies, the various entrepreneurs who were present from the Wheeling area, or for that matter, the lawyers from the Wheeling area. They were from nearby western Pennsylvania, Ohio, but there were some that were native to Wheeling, and there were some that came from as far away as Connecticut. So yes, they had very little in common with the leadership of Eastern Virginia. The question is, where did they draw the line? Literally, where did they draw the boundary? And the Kanawha lawyers, Smith and Brown, there's one passage, and I couldn't find it again, because coming from White Sulphur Springs, I was naturally interested in it, but one of them said, we have to have that area. That's where we go in the summer. That's still, if you've ever driven by one of those nice old houses in Lewisburg and seen a garden party or a wedding where the bridesmaids wear picture hats, you know where they're from. They're people from the Kanawha Valley that have money. Having ruined the Kanawha Valley, they come up to the Greenbrier Valley to get away from the mess that they've made. But they also had to think two things. Did they really want to inherit a full third of that Virginia debt that was accumulated in financing 4 different rail lines leading west from Alexandria, Richmond, Petersburg, and Norfolk? Or that was one thing. And the other thing is they had to think about what was the most defensible military line if, in fact, it did become an international border. And they chose the top of Allegheny Mountain, which brought my ancestors, who were mostly Confederate, into the state. And it brought the Lewisburg newspaper, which I don't think changed to West Virginia for nearly a generation. But it also created the West Virginia that we know today, and it seems perfectly natural that your license plates are different on either side of Allegheny Mountain. I have to say that for reasons that's too elaborate to go into, Mr. Justice's operations is the completion of West Virginia statehood. The Greenbrier has been such a pious monument, such a phony monument to the Old South. And he has made it a West Virginia place, and I think it's absolutely great. And so I say that's the end of the Civil War in West Virginia. The West Virginia's conquest of the Greenbrier, in any case.
Yes, thank you so much for your knowledge and your presentation. I had a little question about James Brown versus John Brown in West Virginia. Were they related?
No. It's like Williams and Smith. You know? Okay. Could be anyway.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the availability of investment capital. Was that during that period of time? How accessible was that investment capital to blacks that were settling in West Virginia?
Yeah, probably not very accessible. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are instances. I'm trying to think if I've come across any. Of course, I was interested when I did research mostly into the impact of slavery. Mm-hmm. The Kanawha lawyers were slave owners. One of the things that Benjamin Smith did as attorney for the federal attorney for Western Virginia was try to recover a slave that he had owned who ran away and was behind Union Army lines, actually run away from his son who was serving in the Confederate Army. And you can read all about that in the papers of Rutherford B. Hayes, who happened to be the Union colonel who said no and got the black man who was involved, got him up to Ohio, to his home in Fremont, Ohio, so that Smith couldn't get hold of him. So that there were people who had accumulated small amounts and had small businesses, like barbershop. Barbers were very significant. That was almost exclusively a black preoccupation, or an occupation at that time. And there is a Parkersburg barber whose diary, I think, has been published, who was a black man, and he would have accumulated a small amount of capital. The question is whether he would have had access to larger amounts through the banks. And he would have been, even if, of course, West Virginia, every black West Virginian that I interviewed said they were much happier living here than they would have been in Virginia. In fact, there was one man who had moved from Welch to Harper's Ferry, and I interviewed him in Jefferson County, as southern as the local gentry try to be in Jefferson County. He said, I'd much, much rather be living here than in the state of Virginia. And I think the fact that West Virginia adopted laws that prohibited the enforcement of Virginia and Kentucky segregation laws inside the state was significant. But nevertheless, it was still, the West Virginia statehood movement was a white man's movement. It was a man's movement. Women weren't involved. Blacks weren't involved. And it's difficult to read back our modern attitudes into that period. I hope that wasn't too...
Well, yeah, I was just curious how advanced is the entrepreneurial program that you're dealing with now? Because I'm actually from Washington, D.C., but I live in Martinsburg, West Virginia now, which is in Berkeley County.
Which is part of Metro D.C.
Exactly. All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Time for a couple more questions.
Thanks for a great presentation. Just confirming your remarks about the Greenbrier touts itself as being in the Allegheny Mountains, and the signs in the
I'm sorry?
It touts itself as being in the Allegheny Mountains, not Appalachian.
No, oh, no.
And the signs...
Not since the 60s, anyway.
Yeah, right. And the signs in the halls where people are sleeping says, quiet, it's sleepy time down south. I have a question. You've talked about...
But that does come from the promotions of the 30s and the Dorothy Draper era.
Well, absolutely.
That Southernism. The first mammy, there used to be a mammy serving tea in the lobbies. She was from Connecticut, and her costume was designed by Dorothy Draper.
Oh, my God.
And, it was just pure Hollywood Old South. And it was, apparent if you look at any interest in history that there were parts of it that were just totally made up from the whole cloth.
That started in the 30s?
But, yeah, well, that's when the Virginia wing. It was the 1890s when it started.
No, I meant the the sale of
The Sleepy Downtown South thing, I think, as far as I know. I'm not working on a history of the hotel, but on the town. So,
Right.
and I have been able to document the role of segregation in the workforce at the Greenbrier, and it was carefully regulated well into the 1970s. Certain jobs went to blacks, certain jobs went to women, certain jobs went to black women, black men and so forth. It's really interesting, and it's all there in the employee.
Parallel to the coal mines.
Pardon?
A parallel with the coal mines.
Yeah, it is. It is, to some extent, yeah. That's what the man from Harper's Ferry had grown up in Welch, and he made the same point.
Question I had, you talked about lawyers who played such an important role with regard to entrepreneurship and extractive industries. What I'm wondering is, were there lawyers who had concerns about the rights of working people who resisted the capture of the courts and the government system? Harry Caudill talked about the most important elected positions in Kentucky being the tax assessor and the circuit court judge. Mm-hmm. And lawyers, they had to be paid, and they were being paid by money interest. But were there lawyers who pushed back?
I haven't found any in the statehood period, but my intensive research has been from the 1980s on, 1880s, sorry, focused on the industrial period, and yes, there were. James Murray Mason, the guy who headed the Tax Commission of 1884, was the first to provide an indictment of the colonial economy. That would be a case of a man named Sam Montgomery. Both from old Virginia families. The town of Montgomery is named for Montgomery's family. And James Murray Mason's father was a Confederate diplomat. Those are two examples I can think of off the top of my head. And then later on, Matthew M. Neely would be another.
Thank you.
Next question. You mentioned in your talk that as late as 1897, the state only employed 100 employees.
Right.
Did something happen in 1897 that changed the way the state was?
Well, of course, and I'm drawing on that in Governor McCorkle's memoirs. His political patronage was very significant for middle class. The first graduate of this law school was an avid seeker of political jobs. But that was the figure he gave, the number of appointments that he could make when he became governor in 1897. What happened all over the country, and that really is, I guess, the larger point. The national economy is pretty much what drove West Virginia's future. And nationwide, there was more demand to license undertakers or nurses or doctors or whatever. There were more prisoners in the pen. The coming of the automobile created a whole set of functions to the state. The demand for public education. My alma mater, White Sulphur High School, was created in 1912, 3 years after the town was created. That's one of the things that differentiated people who lived in town from people who lived in the country in that critical period from around 1900 to 1930, when there was a real gap between country living and town living. They had a high school. They had movie theaters. They had all sorts of things. And all of those were businesses. And of course, businesses, if you want to appoint a lot of people to government jobs in order to reward your supporters, which was almost universal among West Virginia politicians, you got to have money to pay them, and you got to have taxes. And given the resistance of the coal industry and the oil and gas industry to severance taxes, the business licenses was a major source of revenue. So that all combined to bring a general multiplication of government jobs. But not until 1932, the state bureaucracy was not very large in West Virginia compared to other states, more urban states, actually. The 1932, the tax limitation amendments changed that to some extent. Yeah, talking to the microphone. I left my hearing aid at home.
I wondered if you'd looked at the patents that were granted in West Virginia at the beginning.
That's a good question, and the answer is no. I mean,
that's
I
something
should
maybe
have, and I would advise if there are any young historians here, that's a good source of information. Somebody was telling me about a really interesting source, a map that has patent information. And that's something that you could get at. That I overlooked.
All right, that's what I wanted to know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Williams. We'll give everyone Before you leave the podium, students would like to present you something, a little small token of our appreciation.
Oh, nice.
Dr. Williams, we would like to present this plaque to you as a small token of our appreciation. We really couldn't imagine having a better speaker for this event, and so we are so very grateful to you for joining us today.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
You do realize I'm in the de-accessioning phase of life, but I promise you won't find this in a flea market.
Well, we have a few minutes between now and the next panel, so we need panelists to come to the front and get seated and get organized, and we may have like 3 minutes to run to the bathroom or get something to drink if someone
See, you're probably more used to making presentations and clients, and I'm doing this. This would be out of the building, it's usual for me. You know what I mean? Yeah, you got more experience with this.
I'm good, thanks, man. I actually want to go ask you questions. I understand that the glass industry was a big deal here for a period of time. I wondered what the entrepreneurial and historical implications of that were. I knew it boomed and busted.
That's actually that's really big in Wheeling. They still have something like that up there.
This thing on Beechhurst used to be the Seneca Center. That used to be a glass thing. And you can go down on the river and find shards of chunks of glass from some manufacturer. My wife is going to check this out.
Yeah. That's big stuff on the second resort in Wheeling. It's called Bumblebee. And they have like scaling pods and stuff like that. They have a whole entire world of stuff dedicated to glass.
This part after later in the winter with this festival. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard the term Morgantown glass before.
Yeah, there's Morgantown glass, Parksburg.
It's like a blue color. Yeah, it's really interesting. I'd like to at the reception, I'd like those brains. I'm going to get this one. It was neat. They should just give them to you when you show up to the state.
Hey, anything is good for me. I'm low maintenance.
I need help. He's going to be fine. He's great.
Huh? Yeah.
Get all our stuff away.
So, you'll figure it out. I have one question.
I think Oh, panelist is going to come up here? Oh, that's what they're going to do? No problem.
So I'll just say one thing right here. Excellent. We will now turn to our panel discussion. And before we get to the panel, I wanted to first thank Attorney Steve Crislip because he was so instrumental with helping me think about the panel and some of the speakers. So I do want to basically show my appreciation to you for that. Yeah, I'll turn it back to our MCs.
Our first speaker is the acclaimed James H. Disson. He has been in the energy industry for quite some time and is considered an expert on energy. He is a partner and senior vice president for corporate development at Triana Energy, LLC, headquartered in Charleston, West Virginia. He received his bachelor's in business administration from Wheeling Jesuit University, his MBA from Xavier University, and his doctorate of jurisprudence from Duquesne University School of Law. He has over 40 years of experience in human resources, labor relations, in the natural gas distribution, transmission, exploration, and production of energy and gas-related. He was the chief spokesman for Columbia Gas System companies in the collective bargaining sessions. Mr. Disson is not only a businessman, but he has served our country very well. He is an Army veteran, having served as a special agent in counterintelligence during the Cold War. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of Charleston, where he teaches several business management courses. He is chairman of Star USA Federal Credit Union and Highland Hospitals. He currently sits on boards of Wheeling Jesuit University and the West Virginia Chamber of Commerce. Please help me welcome Mr. James H. Disson.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure what acclaim means, but I'll take it. With me today, I want to introduce a few people, and I'll tell you a reason why. Is my daughter, Anna Crislip, who was an attorney with Bowles Rice and a 2009 graduate of this university, who I'll be calling on later, so pay attention. Her husband, Dr. Seth Crislip, and as we mentioned before, Steve Crislip, who's general counsel with Jackson Kelly, who was also my booking agent, so I'm glad to be here, who will also be critiquing me. What I've been asked to do is comment on the future of entrepreneurship in West Virginia in 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is take you through what I think a person who's going to be an entrepreneur needs to have and needs to know, but to ensure we're all at the same starting point. Let's point out what certain entrepreneurs, what skill and mindsets they need to be successful, and what you need to start thinking about what it takes to run a business. According to the U.S. Business Administration, there were 27.2 million small businesses in the United States in 2007. West Virginia has over 35,000 small businesses. Generally, a owner-manager small business of 1 to 50 employees are considered small business, although that number can change depending on what your cutoff numbers are going to be. An entrepreneur is a person who owns or starts an organization such as a business. The word entrepreneur, as mentioned earlier, is French, meaning one who undertakes an endeavor. Anna, is that correct? Anna is fluent in French, and when she studied in Paris, she was a great tour guide. So if anybody goes there, we're happy to help you out. Therefore, an entrepreneur then is a person who has possession of a new enterprise, venture, or idea and assumes significant accountability for the inherent risks and outcomes. Why would someone want to become an entrepreneur? Most entrepreneurs mention 3 key rewards: flexibility, a livable income, and personal growth. And I think anyone who was at that luncheon today, and I forget the name of the company, but the young lady who had the shirt company, some of those qualities is what she pointed out her and her husband needed. Is that correct? Okay. What are myths about small business? Anytime you're in a small business, there's always somebody who says, oh, you can't do it. So here's some myths. Not enough financing. You can't start a business during a recession. To make profits, you need to make something. If you fail, you can never try again. Students don't have the skills to start a business. Well, let's look at that. Not enough financing. The greatest availability is where you would expect it to find it, from family, friends, and other individuals, collectively known as informal capital. You can't start a business during a recession. You will need to start lean, no fancy offices, but according to a 2009 Business Week report, 7 of the 10 largest companies in the 2009 Fortune 500 were started during a recession. For example, General Electric, Allstate, CNN, Krispy Kreme, Southwest Airlines. You need to make something to make a profit. A number of the most profitable industries for small business are service provider types: dentists, tax preparers, mining support services, credit counselors, on and on. So you can go into the service type industry. If you fail, you can never try again. If you close a business and pay off your debts, you did not fail. A large number of today's successful entrepreneurs have failed along the way, but they learn from their earlier mistakes. Students don't have the skills to start a business. If you are a student, you probably have a good idea what other students want to buy or have. That is the start of a retail business with a student market. The social network was started by students. Now, in order to start a business, you should think about 4 elements that need to come together. It's called the BRIE model. B-R-I-E. The first is boundary, creating a place for your business in location and in people's minds. Resources, you need the money, the product, the knowledge that makes up your business. Intention, the desire to start a business. If you don't have a desire to start a business and put the time in, you're not going to be successful. In exchange, moving resources, product, or services in exchange for money. Okay, now that you've gotten over the myths and you have successfully figured out the dream model for your particular endeavor, will it work? In February, a Future of Entrepreneurship Education Summit was held at the University of Central Florida. They primarily discussed how the entrepreneurship education field can be scaled to help decrease global unemployment. The following are some interesting statistics that come out of the summit. Here, some of these statistics are: small business is the engine of America's economy. It creates the jobs that sustain our communities and the opportunities to turn ideas into reality. Over 1,600 individuals who were at this summit, ages 16 to 39, or 89% of respondents believe entrepreneur education is imperative today, given the new economy and the job market. But 73% were not offered classes on entrepreneurship in college. President Obama, in the State of the Union address, emphasized recharging the American economy through entrepreneurship. There was a silent culture uprising of Generation Y entrepreneurs that for the first time in history have united in their collective belief that they can change the world through constructive, positive business. Entrepreneurs create technology, create jobs, and most importantly, create wealth. This is something we need to concentrate on. We need to train people about the risk of not taking a risk. Entrepreneurs solve problems, and solving problems isn't always about being the smartest person in the room. It's more about being a team player, knowing how to execute and help others be the best they can be, mentoring. The world of get educated, get a job, retire, get a gold watch, and a defined benefit pension is indeed dead. That was my era, not yours. So what's left for the next generation to do? That's you. You become entrepreneurs. 150 years ago, probably all people living in West Virginia were entrepreneurs at some level. Today in West Virginia, in round numbers, there are approximately 35,000 employers as taken from workers' compensation accounts. Of those, 40 employers have 1,000 or more employees. 150, give or take, employers have between 500 to 1,000 employees. 100 to 500 employers have about 350 or so employees. So that means that over 34,000 employers have 100 or less employees, with the vast majority being below 50 employees. Given those numbers and the fact that West Virginia unemployment rate climbed to 10.3% in January, or about 79,500 unemployed, it would appear that the expectations of one getting the gold watch are indeed dead. But the future for entrepreneurs in West Virginia is golden. There was an article entitled, "The Impact of Unemployment on Entrepreneurship, Empirical Evidence from France," dated March 1, 2007. Briefly, the article came to these conclusions. In contrast to the widespread assumption that entrepreneurs are born, the reality they experience is that entrepreneur circumstances play a high role in explaining different levels of entrepreneurship across regions and countries. The article gives strong support for unemployment as a key factor for entrepreneurship. The empirical study also presents evidence about the effects of the local socioeconomic environment on entrepreneurship. Basically, geography matters. The study suggests that there are three determinants of entrepreneurship: high unemployment rate, population growth, and a highly qualified working population. The study also showed, however, that unemployment affects entrepreneurship even more than population growth. Okay. We know that West Virginia is and has been a good place for entrepreneurs, but the entrepreneur has to also assess his or her strengths before you could start your own business. You have to assess your psychological readiness for starting a business. What is your experience and exposure relevant to the chosen business segment? Try to get expert business advice on your chosen niche. Your ability to have a definitive understanding of your competitors in the market segments. Preparedness of your own investment capital and readiness of other investors in helping hands on your business.
Now, you've done all that. All you need now is to sell yourself as an entrepreneur. But being successful goes beyond effective marketing of your business. You will need to present yourself in a favorable light. And when you meet clients, peers, and investors, if you can do this, people will be more receptive to what you have to say. Excuse me. Here are a few suggestions. Dress the part. Depending on who you are meeting with, dress to inspire confidence. Self-confidence. Some people are naturally outgoing and self-confident. If you're a shy person, you will need to overcome this personality trait. A big part of being an entrepreneur is selling, and you can't do this if you mumble and don't make eye contact. Knowing your business. You want to be taken seriously, you need to know your business in detail, including the financials. The benefits of selling yourself. If you can be successful selling yourself, you will inspire confidence in others about your company and its products and services. It does not matter how much you may spend on marketing. When someone meets you face to face, it will take precedent. If they like you, they'll work with you. If they don't, they won't. What about challenges facing women and minorities and late career entrepreneurs in starting a small business? Women-owned businesses are one of the fastest growing sectors of all U.S. businesses. About 30% of all businesses are majority owned by women. The other 18% equally owned with women and men. Minority-owned businesses represent about 11%. Since they own the business, they do not have the traditional discrimination issues they face in working for somebody else. But both women and minorities face the challenges of access, and we heard that before. They may be excluded from the opportunities offered to firms owned by whites, males. This probably results from the way the networks built over the years from interpersonal relationships, from shared hobbies, sports, college ties, social events, golf outings, etc., that are mostly male and white dominated, and this can lead to unintegrated business networks. This type of discrimination crops up most oftenly in the access to financing. What about late career entrepreneurs? Those who retire early, were downsized, or retired from a job with a large company, and now they want to do something else. They face unique challenges. Excuse me, adjusting to an entrepreneur life. There's no office staff that can give you support. You know, you want to get paper clips, you have to order them yourself. No one's going to do it for you. Loss of confidence, especially if you were laid off or forced to retire early. Keeping personal finances out of the business. So what do you need to do? The same as all other entrepreneurs. Get involved in associations, clubs, etc., to make the contacts and build relationships through networking to achieve your objectives. It's not a deterrent, but an opportunity to once again market yourself and your company. Since I spent most of my working life in the natural gas industry, and since the Marcellus Shale was a hot topic in the Appalachian Basin, what opportunities are available for small business owners in these environments? Most small business owners will not have the financial resources or experience to actually drill a well. But you can provide support services. You could go into real estate. You could come up with housing for some of the guys on the crews who are living away from home. You could start a contracting to help build the roads, site preparation, environmental support services, trucking to haul the materials. You can contract with geologists or engineering support for design work. Rental, you can do rental equipment on tanks and all the different pumping equipment that's needed on the job site. There are any number of things you can do, support services to support this industry. So the message is pretty clear for West Virginia. We have a new generation of potential entrepreneurs in our state who have the creative thinking, motivation, opportunity recognition, and entrepreneur alertness to identify good opportunities to create jobs and wealth. For example, there's a company like Smooth Ambler located outside of Lewisburg. They were started by two individuals to produce quality high-end spirits. I know most of you college students haven't drank their products, but I understand it is sold in Morgantown. But I have some brochures up there that I got. Mr. Christop and I visited the distillery a few weeks ago, and I want to get some ideas from the owners of how they started their business. And he provided me some handouts, and anyone's interested in what they did, you ought to take a look at it. We therefore have two choices. We can help entrepreneurs launch and grow their companies by giving them access to the resources they need, including financing and mentoring, or we can watch them pack their bags and take their ideas and talents to some other state. But why would we let them do that? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Ann LaFaso. Dr. LaFaso is a professor here at the West Virginia University College of Law, where she teaches courses in employment law, labor law, advanced labor law, and socioeconomics and related seminars. And I've taken all of them. Professor LaFaso focuses her scholarly attention on workplace law. She began her career as an attorney for the New York firm Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McLeod, where she practiced in bankruptcy and business reorganization. From the private practice, she then moved to the National Labor Relations Board, which is a federal agency that prosecutes unfair labor practices. She holds a bachelor's from Harvard University, where she graduated magna cum laude. She also has a JD from the University of Pennsylvania, where she served as an editor of the Labor Law Journal and won 2 prizes for papers written on comparative labor and employment law. Dr. LaFaso was also a Fulbright scholar and received her PhD at Oxford University in London, where she wrote a dissertation about American, British, and European legal responses to mass economic dismissal. Recently, she co-authored the book Growing Up under Title IX in Reversing Field, examining commercialization, labor, gender, and race in the 21st century. Please help me welcome Dr. Ann LaFaso.
Is this mic working? Yes? Great, because I'm going to stay here. I'm going to be a little more informal. So, because that's what I'm used to in the classroom. So, first of all, I just want to thank the Entrepreneurship Clinic and Patricia Lee and also all the other people that put this together. I'm very proud of the students. This is really wonderful. And Patricia, you've obviously done a great job with them. So we're really lucky to have someone like you here. And I think my remarks will dovetail nicely with Mr. Disson's and with Grant's. So as far as I understand what Grant's going to be talking about. What I want to do is focus a little bit about jobs and entrepreneurship and innovation. And what my theme is a call for economic diversification in the state of West Virginia. Let me start by saying that it's very important to have diversification because diversification is cited as one of the main buffers against steep economic decline, especially during recession. Currently in north central West Virginia and the eastern panhandle, they're the only areas in West Virginia that have a truly diversified economy. Those 2 areas were in many ways forced to diversify, in part because they either didn't have coal or coal was depleted in those areas. So I thought it would be useful, being that I am an academic, to give a little bit of a snapshot and historical account. This will not be this will not be a real historical account, so please do not hold me to your great standards of your PhD from that school in Connecticut. But I'm just taking a snapshot. Anyway, post-Civil War West Virginia economy, quick snapshot: salt mines in the Kanawha Valley, River Valley, coal mines in the southern and central West Virginia, farming in the eastern panhandle, and steel in the northern panhandle. We know the story of many of those. The steel industry in the northern panhandle has dwindled. People are selling their farms in the eastern panhandle because they can get a lot of money for that land. We know that coal is a finite resource, but coal will be here for at least 100 years, maybe some people optimistically say 200 years. I like to be conservative, let's say 100 years. We also recently found Marcellus Shale all over, or over most of the state. The highest growth areas are in IT and in healthcare. Most of the jobs in the next 10 years, decade, see that the growth is in those areas. Almost all of those growth areas will require at least an associate's degree. West Virginia has a civilian labor force of 782,500. Our population is about 1.8 million. Our employment rate is 708,000. So our unemployed, about 73,000. That's an unemployment rate of 9.4%, which is relatively high historically. But that doesn't tell the whole story. What we need to look at is what kinds of industries do we have here and what are their trends. Now, that will only give us a picture to react to, but we need to be proactive. Here's a little snapshot. Of the approximately 745,000 non-farm jobs, okay, remember we have our civilian labor force is 782,000, so non-farming jobs 745,000. Mining and logging is 31,000 with an 8% 12. This will be, I'll give you the percentages, it will be the 12-month percentage change. So mining and logging, unfortunately I couldn't find mining versus logging. I don't have those broken out, so I don't know how that works. Mining and logging, we have an increase of 8%. Construction, 30,000 jobs, a decrease since last year of 6.5%. My guess is that stimulus money has run out. Manufacturing, 49,000 jobs, a slight increase of 0.8%, so less than 1% increase, so that's about stable. Trade, transportation, utilities, 135,000, that's also stable at 0.8% increase. Information sector, 2% increase, but only 10,000 jobs. Financial activities, 28,000 jobs, a slight decrease, so pretty stable at 0.7%. Professional and business services, 61,000 jobs, 3% increase since last year. Education and health services, a 2% increase since last year. We have 122,000 jobs. By the way, this is as of February 2011, very recent data. Leisure and hospitality, 74,000 jobs at a 4.8% increase. Other services, 55,000 jobs, 1.3% increase. And government, down 2.4% with 147,000 jobs. And that's the largest sector, 147,000 jobs is our government. Again, this doesn't tell the whole story. You need to look at a couple other things that are very, very important. Our geography. I'm getting this data from Senator Rockefeller, so if it's wrong, you need to blame him. We are the only state in which every county is considered an Appalachia. I've heard him say it 3 times, so I figure it must be right he said it 3 times. So the only state where every single county is in Appalachia, 4% of the state, only 4% is flat. This is important. Why? Because when you have mountains, it is very difficult to build roads. And if it's difficult to build roads, it's expensive to build roads, which means getting the same amount of money to build roads in West Virginia, or if you get the same amount of money in West Virginia versus New York, you can build more roads in New York, suppose, at least all other things being equal. It's very expensive to build roads in West Virginia. Very important, because think about it. Think about the United States in the 1800s, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and what did people do? What did politicians do? The first thing they did, they built infrastructure. They built canals, they built railroads, and they built roads. We do not have a high-speed train to either the 2 major cities near us, D.C. and Pittsburgh. Another important thing that we need to think about is look at the other Appalachian states that are near us, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. What is the main difference between Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee on the one hand, and West Virginia on the other hand, West Virginia does not have a major city. Let's just compare it to Kentucky. Kentucky has Lexington and Louisville. Each of those cities, so those two cities, each have approximately, now this is 2008 data, 260,000 people. That's more than 5 times larger than our largest city of Charleston, which is 51,000. Major urban areas are job creators. They have commerce, they have trade, they have banking. So there's two or let's call them challenges. That's what entrepreneurs like to use, challenges as opposed to obstacles. Challenges for us. One is that we have our two main cities, not to mention also some cities in Ohio like Columbus and Cleveland, but our two main cities, Pittsburgh and D.C., very difficult to get to. 3 hours to D.C., an hour and 15 minutes to Pittsburgh. Relatively easy to get to Pittsburgh, but only if you're in Morgantown, really, right? But there's no high-speed way of getting there. There's no rail. And right now, we don't have a major city. Now, I've heard some people talk about, well, combining metropolitan areas so that Morgantown would really be Mon County. But that only is that's a good marketing tool to get people here to say, well, Mon County, because Mon County is bigger than Morgantown. But you still have the issue that Morgantown is still Morgantown, which is a city of about 30,000. I haven't looked at the latest data, but it's probably about 30,000. And then the area itself is probably about 75,000. Barbara, do you think that's about? No, what is it? Oh, it's higher. It's bigger. That's great. Okay. 96,000. That's great. Okay, so 96,000 in the metropolitan area. That's really good. In the county. Okay, I was thinking Morgantown itself. Okay, and what's the city of Morgantown? I would think it's about, without the students, about 30. That's what I would thought. Okay. So this is a challenge for us in terms of this is one of our challenges. But on the flip side, we are in Appalachia, which means we are very resource wealthy. And our resources are, at least for right now, it looks like gas and coal. But I don't want to confuse those resources. Those resources are definitely revenue creating, and that's very important. But they're not necessarily job creating. Yes, they are going to create jobs. I don't want to be that provocative. They're going to create jobs in the short run. I'm not sure how much in the long run, but certainly in the short run. But what we have to understand is look at the history of coal. And this is very important. Technology makes coal more productive, which is good, right? Because coal has become cheaper. That's good for the United States. But you don't need coal miners. So, and if you have less than, and look at the population of West Virginia, what's happened in the last census. It has migrated from the south and from the western part of the state to the northern part of the state, central, and to the eastern panhandle, away from coal. Okay? So, and look at where there's been economic diversification in the northern parts and not in the southern parts, which is how I started the talk, which is that there is some industry in the southern part, but it's not diversified. That, to me, is a challenge for our state. Okay, so what do? We have many challenges, but we also have many, I think there's a lot of good news. We know that immediate growth area is in jobs that are in more service industry sector that needs education, at least a 2-year degree. But we also know the following. Despite the fact, here's some more good news, but I started with despite, which means there's going to be some bad news. Despite the fact that we actually we're something like either 4th or 5th in the country in putting in money per capita for education. So I just want to applaud our our representative in the back there for that. I really appreciate that. And it's wonderful. We still are only 25% of our state of working adults between 25 and 64 hold a 2-year degree compared to 38% national average. This is typical of Appalachia, by the way. So somehow that's not translating into higher education, which means our people can't get those jobs. So I think West Virginia University has a role to play in creating pipelines and encouraging higher education among our high school students and working with the state and the legislature in doing that. But again, that's reactive. We have to be proactive and think about a generation from now, that's 30 years from now, 2 generations from now, and a century from now, 3 or 4 generations from now. And what is this going to look like? So the first thing I think we need to do is we have to start to think of ourselves, which I think we are, as an energy state, not as a coal state. If you look at, like, say, Consol, it's no longer only a coal. It's actually diversified into Marcellus Shale. If you talk to people at Consol, they'll tell you you can't, if you diversify too much in one particular company, that you don't necessarily have the expertise. But that doesn't mean the state can't diversify in other areas. But we do have, it's good. It's very good that we found, it's wonderful that we're resource rich. So I can't say that enough. And that will be a job creator, but let's face it, technology will come, and we shouldn't stop that. I know I'm a labor lawyer, I'm not supposed to say that, but technology is important, and it's wonderful that technology will make things more productive. We should want businesses to be more productive. But we have to deal with the fallout of that, which is then those people will not have jobs. So what do? And if those are the only jobs in that area, what happens? If you're in you guys all know this story. What happens if the only industry in your town is a coal field? And that coal field, that dries up. That means the schools dry up, the grocery stores dries up. It has secondary, tertiary, and more effects. And that's what's happened in the southern part of West Virginia, in part at least. Okay. I think we need to also think about urban growth. And I started talking about that before, I think in 2 ways, though. One is this idea of Pittsburgh-DC connection. And again, this is I'm not being pragmatic here at all. I haven't thought about the pragmatics of this. I imagine this is incredibly hard. But we need to figure out a way of connecting West Virginia to those 2 cities in a much better way, a much more efficient manner than driving over the mountains, at least to D.C., and the drive to Pittsburgh. So that's one. And by the way, then bringing it more into the interior. I mean, the first step is Morgantown, but there's also Charleston, there's parts of the interior. Okay. Another thing is, I do, and maybe some of you know a lot more about this, there's the I-79 high-tech corridor. I don't know much about that. What I know about it, it looks really great. So I'd love to hear some information, comments about that from you guys. I think another high growth area, of course, is the Eastern Panhandle. But I don't think we should forget other towns such as Wheeling, which was potentially, right now, I've been to Wheeling. Parts of it are very depressed. It's true. But it was rivaling Pittsburgh at the turn of the century as an industrial powerhouse. And I think the other one is, what's the name? It's Parkersburg. I was going to say where Dan's from. Parkersburg, which is very well situated geographically. Okay, but I am not an urban planner. I have no idea at this point. I'm just starting the conversation of how to get growth in those cities. Okay? But I would like to put that in people's mind that we need to have some urban growth there. And finally, another, what I want to touch upon is this infrastructure one more time, talking about the bridges. 39% of West Virginia's bridges are structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. We need to put money into that. We have high-hazard dams in West Virginia. There's 245 of those. And that's a high-hazard dam is defined as a dam whose failure would cause a loss of life and significant property damage. When I was writing this talk, I was actually very optimistic, and now I feel like I've just given you a lot of bad news. But but I am very optimistic because I think that we do have a lot of innovators here. I think we just need to look at what the data shows us so we know where to act. And what I would say is we need to act in the areas of education, infrastructure. I would love to see someone do a research project on what I was suggesting, which is about where there's potential for urban development. I think we need to do a real 30, 60, and 100-year outlook. I really mean that, a long-term outlook about energy and where the jobs are and where they're not going to be also. I agree with my panelist that there is a lot of opportunity in the energy area in terms of supporting that, but we need to also look beyond that 30 years from now when there will be less jobs. And what is going to be left? It can't be the monopoly of the energy company. There has to be other economic diversification. So I'll leave you with that, is a call for, a plea for economic diversification in this state. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. LaFaso.
All right. Our third and final panelist this afternoon is Mr. Grant Baerle. And what a great segue from what Professor LaFaso and Mr. Disson have said. Grant's story fits well. He's received the bulk of his education here in West Virginia, attended high school in Buchanan, and enrolled at West Virginia University as a Promise Scholar. He graduated cum laude from WVU's College of B&E with a BA in finance. He is currently a third-year law student at WVU, and he is also a member of the Entrepreneurship Law Clinic. Most recently, Grant is a finalist in this year's West Virginia statewide business plan competition, and he's the inventor of CardRex, and he owns a new business startup called CardRex LLC. That business is a service business that focuses on eliminating hard copy, administrative record systems, and updating them with attractive, instantly verifiable USB cards. Please welcome Grant Baerle.
Thanks, Brian. When I came to Morgantown nearly 8 years ago, it seemed like a very different place than it is today. To drive to the university, I'd have to take the West Virginia University exit off Interstate 79. Once I hopped off the exit, I'd be greeted with a narrow, two-lane road and a single gas station on my way to town. The large shopping center that currently inhabits Granville was merely a big grassy hill. The same story goes for much of the remaining surrounding areas of the town, as many would say that Morgantown just seemed to blossom within the last decade. But how do we categorize all this new development? Why is it that Morgantown seemed to prosper, while other places in the state and the cities across America struggled? Well, I believe, and there seems to be ample support to suggest, that the service sector plays a critical role in these developments. But what exactly is considered the service sector? Well, in reality, the service sector is a pretty broad category. The service sector pertains to the soft parts of the economy, where people are the primary drivers of business. This can include government, healthcare, education, banking, retail, tourism, the hospitality industry, and sales, among others. It is easy to see how the service sector has become the primary economic driver, not only in Morgantown, but also in the nation. In fact, according to the MSA Outlook pamphlet in your booklets, during the past 5 years, the fastest employment growth in the Morgantown metropolitan statistical area was in the leisure and hospitality sector, which grew an average of 4.4% per year. This was followed by growth in the professional and business services industry at 2.8% per year, and the health and education services sector at 2.6% per year. Better yet, the forecast predicts overall job growth in Morgantown to continue at an average of 1.8% per year over the next 5 years. So I'm sure you all are thinking, okay, these figures are great and all, but what does that really have to do with me? Well, I'd like to zoom in from this overall outlook and illustrate the force that is actually driving these figures. That force is the people, or more specifically, the entrepreneurs. So again, entrepreneur, another seemingly broad term. If you look it up in the dictionary, you'd likely find a definition that states something similar to one who organizes a business venture and assumes a risk for it. Well, I don't feel like those definitions really do the term justice for what an entrepreneur actually is. I feel like an entrepreneur is a combination of many different professions, all rolled into one. Each entrepreneur is also unique from the next. You will never find two that think and operate exactly the same. In my opinion, an entrepreneur is part architect, part engineer, part manager, part salesperson, part mechanic, part artist, part analyst, part gambler, and part prophet. Of course, this list is not exhaustive. Each entrepreneur is a different breed from the next. And that's what makes being an entrepreneur one of the most challenging tasks one can undertake, while at the same time one of the most rewarding. Now let's take an introspective look at ourselves. I can guarantee that almost every single person sitting here today, at one point or another, has dreamt of starting their own business. I mean, the perks seem to be very alluring. You can work your own hours, pursue your own interests, choose where you allocate your own time, and perhaps most significantly, be your own boss. Unfortunately, these dreams often get clouded by what you believe is more important and pressing matters, such as school, work, or simply a lack of money or time. The inner desire still lurks somewhere inside, and you say to yourself, well, I do want to start a business, but I just can't do it now. But I will someday. Someday. I would just like to say that I think someday is one of the worst words in the English language. The older you get and the longer you wait, the number of responsibilities and obligations that you have in your daily lives will only increase. As each day passes, the number of some days you have left will only diminish, and the number of self-made excuses for not pursuing these dreams will continue to grow. Well, I'm not here to tell you guys that following that dream and starting your own business is not. Well, I'm here to tell you guys that following that dream and starting your own business is not so daunting or far-fetched as you may think, and that you are more equipped to handle the challenge than you may give yourselves credit for. As law students here at this great university, the College of Law has bestowed upon you a very valuable set of tools. Now, you may not believe so, but think about it. You all are trained to identify and resolve problems in a myriad of contexts and scenarios. Your mind is trained to recognize patterns and synthesize elements in order to come up with the strongest conclusions, often after hours and hours of research. Not only that, but your logic game is tight, and even better is that you know all the rules of the game before you start. And if you don't know, well, you have a pretty good idea of where they can be found. It is no coincidence that lawyers can often wind up as chief executive officers or managers of the board of large corporations. This unique skill set we come equipped with is highly regarded and sought after in the business world. What it all boils down to is this. You are better conditioned to perform as an entrepreneur than most people out in the field giving it in their own try. All you have to do is make up your mind and step into the game. So not only do you already come equipped with the mental tools to become great entrepreneurs, but there are many resources available to help you along your way. I'd argue that one of the best resources available, particularly in the startup phase of your business, is located right here downstairs in the law school. I'm talking about the Entrepreneurship Legal Clinic. This clinic is filled with bright-minded, third-year law students who have a genuine interest in entrepreneurship. Many members of the clinic come from professional and academic business backgrounds and would love to help you get started down the road of starting your own successful venture. The ELC, as it is called, offers counseling for startup companies, small businesses, nonprofits, and individuals. They can help with licensing, employer and contractor agreements, intellectual property, financing and venture capital, planning negotiation, dispute resolution, and generalized assistance in business formation, planning, and strategy. And best of all, the ELC service is offered for free. You may be responsible for filing some fees here and there, but those rarely exceed a few $100s. Although the ELC is a great resource, you also find that there are a variety of organizations and entities throughout the state devoted to helping you achieve success as an entrepreneur. These include the West Virginia Small Business Development Center, which actually has 14 locations throughout the state, the Entrepreneurship Center at the WVU College of B&E, various angel investor and venture capitalist groups, as well as many others. In fact, even if you only have an idea to start with, I'd recommend entering the West Virginia State Business Plan Competition. You will have the ability to see your business blossom from a simple 2-page business idea into a real entity with all the help and tools you need to get underway, including the ability to pitch your idea to a panel of judges, many of whom are business leaders throughout the state. I've been fortunate enough to make it to the final round of this year's competition. It's really tough to qualify in words just how much I've gained from participating. It's one thing to learn about forming a business by attending classes or reading books, but the quality of education is nowhere near what you can take from the experience of forming an actual business plan and resolving all issues for your own business. Now, as you can see, there are many opportunities out there to help you get started. These groups and individuals sincerely want to see new businesses start and succeed in West Virginia. You may feel like you are alone if you choose to tread down this entrepreneurial path, but I assure you, you'll find many helpful friends along the way. So there you go. You now understand that Morgantown's strong and growing service sector offers a welcoming place to get started with your business. You also realize that, as a law student, you have a unique, skilled mindset that makes you better equipped than many starting entrepreneurs, and that you also have access to excellent local resources with people who would love to see you succeed. So why not take a shot? After all, today's the youngest you're ever going to be for the rest of your life. I say get out there and take a chance. It may end up being one of the best decisions you've ever made. Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you, Brent. Now we'll take questions from the floor.
I'm Margaret Brennan from Wheeling, and I was so glad to hear Dr. Loffiso speak about our city in the north. One thing that hasn't been touched on, and I wonder if it even fits, and perhaps you could either ignore or touch on this, since you have labor expertise, the trend nationally and in so many states against the unions. Where is West Virginia in all of this? Do we have, what can you say about this related to our state and our growth and industry?
Well, thank you for bringing it up. Actually, our trend is positive. There's been more unionization in West Virginia in the last 12 months. It has not, it's actually gone up about a percentage point. Public sector employees, where the attack is right now, is mostly on collective bargaining. Our legislative body actually supported the public employees in other states, saying that they should not lose their rights. But ironically, perhaps, I don't think any, but certainly not most of our public employees do not have collective bargaining rights. They have a right to organize in the state, but they don't have collective bargaining rights. I think that unions in this state are vital to business partnership. You have to think of it this way. Unions do not want to put businesses out of business, because then unions, their whole purpose is to get jobs for their members. Unions want businesses to flourish. Also, businesses that work well with unions often do flourish, and there's less labor unrest. Now, I think people would have a different, I won't want to speak too much more, because I think people have different ideological ideas about that, and they can certainly disagree with me on that. But the whole purpose of the National Labor Relations Act was actually, and the whole reason it was found constitutional, was because the idea was that without allowing people to come together, to band together for mutual aid or protection, there was so much labor unrest that it was an obstacle to commerce. And so one of the main impetuses behind protecting unionization was actually to smooth out commerce. And I think you can see that really what's happening right now, which is unprecedented in my lifetime, I was born in 1965, is you're seeing a lot more labor unrest as you see oppression of unions. So I don't think it's a good idea. We're not seeing it so much in this state. I think we have a much better relationship with our unions, notwithstanding a couple of companies that have had some bad publicity in the last year. But I don't think we're seeing that, and it's a joy for me to teach labor law in this state.
Great question.
If I could just comment on that. way the labor laws are set up here, they're set up to be adversarial in nature. And when you're running a business, there is an increase in cost if you have a union just to operate. On entrepreneurship, where you have small business, in my view, it would be very difficult to run a small business if you got organized, at least initially until you grew to a size. But the question always is not whether or not unions are good or bad. If you're a business, it's whether or not your particular business, do you need a third party to come between you and the employees? If you do, then the union's there and they have the right under the law to do it. If you don't, I think most business just says, as some of the legislation maybe was proposed by Obama, just don't force it on us. It's a rebuttable presumption, I guess, the legal term.
If I can just respond to that, there is actually a minimum amount of revenue that a business has to make before that a union is, that employer even, the NLRB even has jurisdiction over an employer. So you have to be big enough to begin with. And I think whether it's adversarial or not really depends on the personalities that are involved, and that if you look at what unions have done, they've created every single piece of important working legislation in the country, including the 8-hour day, everything that we enjoy, and they've done it. If you think about it, the teachers have taught the country, the police have protected the country, firefighters have saved the country, the coal miners have energized the country. It's really, and they've done it by banding together for mutual aid or protection. So I think, again, I actually think most of this is ideological, to be honest with you. And we'll have differences of opinion.
Thank you. Are there other questions? We have time for a couple more.
I'm not going to say a word against unions, but I had a question in a completely different direction. The baby boomers are now beginning to be able to take Social Security, and there's this image of West Virginians having had to move away from West Virginia and pining, yearning to come back. And it just seems like in general that there would be a lot of people who might want to live here if they could live here without having to work. I mean, in other words, there's no jobs for them maybe, or there's not enough jobs. But if they could live here and have an income, as a retirement income, I wondered if there's any kind of predictions that you're aware of that there will be an influx of population into West Virginia as the baby boomers retire, and if so, what implications that could have.
I don't know of any studies on that, other than the fact that, I mean, I'm not a native West Virginian, but I've lived here longer than I have in the state I was born. I mean, it's a beautiful state. And I think when people leave it, they want to come back.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that, talk about economic development and just what are we going to be providing. I think the days of the large industry in this state are gone. And I think it is the smaller entrepreneur, the small business service, and maybe coming up with a unique idea that will get them back. But again, boy, if you can come up with a formula for it, I mean, you'd make $1 million. I mean, it's...
I'm going to go right over.
Yeah, become an entrepreneur. Figure this one out.
But I just want to also piggyback on that and say that I don't know of any prediction of people coming other than West Virginians or people who have visited that want to come here, because it is such a beautiful, wonderful state. But we would have a problem if many older baby boomers, meaning the older side of the baby boomers and older beyond that, came. We already have an aging population. We already have one of the most disabled populations, and we would have to consider, if that were to happen, much more about our healthcare industry here and how we would take care of those people.
Thank you. Next question.
I wanted to touch on a second that you brought up the fact that West Virginia's most valuable resources are its natural resources, such as coal and natural gas. And this is only my third year being in West Virginia, but what I seem to have gathered from being here and from reading about, especially from an environmental perspective, that a lot of the companies that actually take advantage of the natural resources aren't actually owned by West Virginia or by West Virginians. And therefore, I feel as though West Virginia has kind of lost control over its most valuable resource. And I'm wondering how entrepreneurship can allow West Virginia or West Virginians to get back control over the best resource that it has to succeed.
I didn't hear that, but it sounded good. I have two comments on that. First of all, one thing I was saying to one of my students the other day is one of the best things that some of the big energy companies can do for West Virginia, besides, it's a big revenue producer, let's face it, and we're an energy state, and it's wonderful that we have these resources. But the best thing they could do actually is move headquarters here, which I don't know if any of them plan to do, but it would be huge. It would be huge if we had leadership from one of the big coal companies or Marcellus Shell companies. But then that's the first thing. But then the second thing is, well, what can entrepreneurs do? Well, entrepreneurs, there's an opportunity right now in Marcellus Shale for entrepreneurs. But we have to somehow attract them, once again, to stay in West Virginia, not just to extract the resource. And because if they stay and they're intelligent and the businesses are bringing their, it has to, my father was a small business owner and grew pretty large. My father-in-law is a business owner, an inventor and an entrepreneur. You're right. This is a problem that West Virginians talk to me about all the time. But I think that you're young, and this is something that you have to keep on fighting about. And I would love to see it if a big energy company would stay here. And I think we do have some, but you're right, a lot, they leave.
I think one of the issues on the energy companies, for example, Triana Energy, we are a West Virginia-based company. Most of us who put it together came from the old Columbia gas system that had their headquarters here. You had Chesapeake Energy, who was going to build a headquarters, northern headquarters down inside of Charleston. I think you have to ask from a historical point of view, why did the headquarters move out? Why did the chemical industry move their headquarters and high-paying staffs out? When I transferred in here in the 70s, you had your CEOs, you had your vice presidents, you had your research people. All went high-paying, went to the tax base. We know why Chesapeake moved out, because of the lawsuit. They couldn't appeal the decision of the Supreme Court. And when you have this, the gas is in the ground. It's not going anywhere. And they'll say, fine, we'll go somewhere else. And when we get the mindset changed, we'll be back. But I think from a historical point of view, it would be good to see just why these companies moved out. The other thing on employment in the industry, to understand how you work when you're drilling for gas, you have the drillers who come in and put the rigs in the ground. And I think the point the professor's making is, yeah, but that's going to go. Understand this. Once you hit gas, you have lines coming out. They're called gathering lines. Somebody has to maintain those. So that's the next industry coming in. Then you have meters. You have meter readers. Then you put into the main transmission lines into the residential. So you have these other industries that as you build this, you're going to have the jobs to sustain that, to keep it going. So, but there is, it's a balancing act. It's a balancing act.
Thank you. Sure. Last question.
Thank you so much, the three of you, for your presentations. I think they were well done. I have questions for all of you, and maybe all of you can just chime in. I'm thinking about education, the cost of education versus the value of people's life experience. The cost of education continues to rise, and you talk about entrepreneurs coming in or small businesses coming in and taking advantage of what resources are available. When you talk about, let's say, the hospitality industry, when you talk about the medical industry in West Virginia, those are areas where you can grow, but the education of the citizenry is so expensive. How you talk about being between a rock and a hard place, the roads, or how you're going to, the infrastructure in West Virginia, how are you going to compromise, I guess, to meet the needs of just the general public that want to get into entrepreneurial development? You talk about the seniors that are coming back, that are baby boomers like myself. You know, I'm 60-something. You know, I'm interested in developing some business opportunities in West Virginia as well. But the cost of education, you can't just jump off and be an entrepreneur. The days of doing it in the garage are really past. How do you speak to developing education and reducing the cost of becoming an entrepreneur?
Well, your question is a great segue into the continuation of this dialogue. And in the fall, we'd like to have another symposium, like number 2, to continue because, you know, the cost of this whole idea of education, of really making this happen, a reality. And so there may be comments that can be responsive today, but I think that is what we will be talking about in the fall. So we hope everyone will come back for part 2 of this conversation.
Thank you.
I mean, I'll take the first shot. I think the education is important, but I think it has to start, my view, it would be from that Southern Florida study, symposium, would be that you ought to start in high school. I mean, start getting the kids ready. You're going to have some who are going to have what they call an entrepreneur alertness. See, my view, you have an organization, you have strategic thinkers and tactical thinkers. A strategic thinker is the one who can see over the mountain. The tactical thinkers are mostly lawyers. Give me a problem, and we handle it, okay? Some of them can make the transition, most of them can't. So you want to start to get those who have the bright eyes and, gee, I'd like to do something a little bit in high school, and then in college level. If they go there, don't have one elective like I'm teaching. You know, have it to bring them along. So take a risk. Don't be afraid. And then the clinic here. You come in and you say, I'd like to start a bit. Where do I start? Go to the clinic, and they can get you going. The thing that I always felt with, and I've been pushing this at 2 different university levels, no one bought into it yet, but with all the baby boomers, and you have kids now from undergraduate going to graduate school. Why? A lot of them want to be there fine. Most of them can't get a job. So, okay, mom, dad, I'm going to the next level. Why not integrate some of the baby boomers who maybe didn't have a chance to go on and get an advanced degree or something, intermix them in with these undergraduates? And man, could you imagine the discussion you'd have in class? You know, wow, I mean, they could just your life experiences. I mean, I think it'd be a great move. Now, whether you can make money on it or not, okay, that's another question, but that's my view, education. Get them going early.
Well, thank you. We've run out of time. And before the panelists leave, we would like to thank all of you with a token of our appreciation.
The Entrepreneurship Law Clinic would like to thank each panel member, and we have a gift in appreciation for your contribution to our symposium. Thank you for providing us with interesting and informative discussion. Thank you.
Season tickets to the football, that's all right. Thank you very much.
While those are being handed out, we want to thank all of you for attending our Sesquicentennial Symposium celebrating West Virginia entrepreneurship. So please join us for a reception in the lobby of the law school. And remember to come back tonight, 7:30 p.m., also to see A New Home for Liberty, Human Rights, Slavery, and the Creation of West Virginia, a historical drama at the Erickson Alumni Center. For more information, you can see the calendar on the law school page or on the Junior Clifford page as well. And so we thank you again and hope to see everyone later this evening and at the reception. Take care.